Joe Bustillos here. Welcome to tonight's Final Thoughts. First off, apologies if this one is going to be a little bit less conversational in tone. I've tried to do this several times, but because it's so personal and complicated, I found myself meandering way too much, and I've resorted to writing my thoughts down. So again, apologies for having to read this, and then also for the not so great eye contact. So here we go. So it's that time of year for me. Most people probably pick New Year's for their reflection, self-examination. It seems like Easter is when I really turn the spotlight inward. Some of the images the phrase self-examination presents probably means that this isn't something that one should do in public. But you know me, what's a little TMI amongst friends? So what's new this year is that I've been spending a goodly amount of time with friends who are decidedly not of any religious persuasion, many of whom have never known the joys of living through normal teenage angst and hormonal confusion with cultural practices and beliefs several centuries out of step with day-to-day experience. They just had to deal with the typical who am I questions without the voice of organized religion chanting in their ears. That's probably a bit too harsh. I grew up in a conservative Catholic household, and it was part of my self-identity and ethnicity that I didn't think twice about, any more than I'd think about breathing the air that's all around me. The one twist, or one of the twists, that probably raised my awareness was that while Mom and I and the siblings all went to church every Sunday, Dad stayed home. You see, he was raised Baptist, but kept it mostly to himself because, well, that's what you did back then to keep some semblance of peace and a united front for the kids in the household. So some level of choice was involved in how one lived one's faith. I don't know that I ever articulated that or really understood that back then, but I noticed that his not going to church with us didn't mean that he didn't believe. He was just having to express it differently. Given that prehistory, it only makes sense that when I was a teenager, that my form of teenage rebellion was to become even more religious. I know, dope! It was the 1970s, the Jesus movement was sweeping through Southern California, and I was struggling with my Catholicism and that teenage hormonal confusion that I'd mentioned earlier. My upbringing, my temperament, and the coincidence of the time and place led to a religious experience or conversion that was as real as anything I'd experienced in my short 15 years of life. Some have famously called religion or religious experience delusional. Given religion's checkered if not tragic reputation across history and cultures, it's easy to see how many would feel this way. I just know that my experiences were genuine, and those closest to me were of the same heart. When I was a freshman religious studies major at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, I read Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, which is one of the first academic scholarly works to investigate religious experience. And I came to eventually understand that there was, or is, something more here than a simple vestigial belief system that belonged to a pre-scientific age. Even though I no longer saw myself as Catholic, I appreciated that part of my journey, and later, as a biblical studies major at Biola University, I recognized the adolescent angst in my classmates who were rejecting their Catholic upbringing for their new Protestantism. Like my father, I chose to experience my faith differently and try to balance my upbringing with my education, and eventually became much less in your face with my faith than I had been as a teenage Jesus freak. I also learned that as much as I studied and meditated, there was always much more than I knew or could really understand. But this didn't squash my curiosity, and maybe it allowed me to be less analytical and more intuitive about my journey and appreciate some of my fellow travelers. There are many scholars and geniuses on both sides of the equation who have probably forgotten much more than I will ever learn or understand. And I say this not as some armchair quarterback who has dabbled in biblical scholarship, but as someone who has spent several years studying at a Jesuit university, and then finished my bachelor's degree in biblical studies at an evangelical university, and then began an amazing master's in theology program at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. My failure to complete that master's degree, well, that's another story entirely. Let's just say that that was another choice that might have led to some interesting problems later on. Getting back to the point, I came to more appreciate that there was a wide assortment of truths in all these varying religious and non-religious points of view, and that, for me, it would be arrogant to make some definitive pronouncement on someone else's experiences or beliefs. As a scholar, I learned that the more one digs, the more one finds additional questions. We can point in a direction, but we usually cannot say exactly what's out there. That's not a failure, that's life. It's about the exploration and not the elusive answers. In fact, this past week, scientists have just found an Earth-sized planet in the habitable zone of another solar system. When I was teaching elementary kids in the computer lab 10 years ago, scientists had yet to find any planets revolving around any other stars. We knew that they had to be out there, but 10 years ago, there wasn't any scientific proof. That's how far we've come and how far we've yet to go. So I choose to continue the inward exploration and try to enjoy the journey and not poke holes in anyone else's attempt to understand themselves or their part in our existence. So to borrow from former pastor turned atheist Jerry DeWitt, I hope that my believing friends had a wonderful Easter weekend, and to my non-believing friends, all I can say is chocolate. And with that concludes this little rambling thought for tonight. And I hope that you enjoyed it, and we will catch you next time. Bye.